Hello everyone, this is going to be a response to a question I had on my last video about gun control. And by the way, if any of you ever have questions, feel free to just put them in the comments, and if I think it's an interesting topic, I'll definitely use it as a video idea. So this comes from YouTube user James Euler. Hey James, I don't remember ever having any contact with you in the past, but he asked what my thoughts are on mental health screenings. I'm against gun control, but I have no clue how to respond to this. So I think this is a very interesting question, and you can approach it from two different ways. What can we do today, and what would we do, or how would it look in a free market or an anarcho-capitalist system? Because I think that those are two very different questions. Well, I think the first thing to point out is that overall, people who have mental health issues are not high risk factors for using guns violently. I haven't looked at all the statistics, but the rates that mentally uh, disabled people or people with severe mental health problems misuse firearms is quite low. Even if you include people who are suicidal, which would probably be the largest group. Um, the vast majority of the homicides that are being committed um, these events that these mass shootings are extremely rare, and actually it's questionable how many of them are actually taken, committed by people with mental health issues. So if we look at Orlando, if we look at San Bernardino, those were clearly terrorist attacks influenced by, Islamic extremism. If we look at this latest attack, this one in Las Vegas, we don't know all the details. We don't know everything about the motivations. Either it's not known or it's being withheld from us at this point. But the man who committed it clearly very carefully planned the event long in advance. He clearly had lots of money at his disposal. Apparently, he was wealthy to some extent. He was wiring hundreds of thousands of dollars just a week before. Um, I don't know that this guy qualifies as just a crazy person. He clearly was very calculated. So, although there's this tendency to want to um, think that, well, since there was so much mass killing, it must be a crazy person. This person was clearly not crazy, or at least from what I can tell, and I think a lot more needs to be revealed. So, you know, we I think like a quintessential case here would be like an Adam Lanza, like at Newtown. That guy seemed to have been like actually mentally disturbed, and that might be a case. But that we are talking, if we're talking about an Adam Lanza style attack, mental health being responsible for what, one or two shootings a year, mass shootings anyway. So if you look at the number of people who have mental health problems and the number of those people that actually do this, it might actually be lower than the general population, or at least near there. I know one of the Rothbard articles I read a long time ago, called in the book compilation Making Economic Sense. He talked about that, how they aren't any more likely to commit a crime than anyone else, and so it's not immediately obvious why there should be a law. Um, but that qualification aside, so what should we do? Well, in the system that we have today, uh, we have a system of negative rights enforced by the government, and we have a very clear right to self-defense and a right to owning weapons. And it's also in the last 100 years, our government has kind of also become an enforcer of positive rights. And those two are in direct opposition, and sometimes they put us in a position where what might be a remedy can't be used. And what I'm thinking of here is they've basically said that not only do you have positive rights to certain government services, say welfare or Social Security or healthcare or anything like that, housing, which they don't treat those as rights per se. Those can be revoked at any point, but they rhetorically treat them as rights and they kind of advertise them as such. But another thing that they do is they eliminate the freedom of association, and they basically tell producers that they are obligated, and retailers that they are obligated to do business with you, right? Um, that you as a business owner cannot discriminate And there are certain exceptions, but they're becoming less and less common. And I think that there's actually something to be said for finding a solution in that. Um, the fact that, you know, they cannot discriminate at all, it really retards any process of developing a system that does discriminate. So in our current system, I don't know that there's anything you can do. The only way to um, prevent it with like something like Adam Lanza would be to just ban the guns completely. Um, the mental health screenings are not going to stop people who don't show signs. They're not going to. It's not going to be practical to mentally screen everyone. The tendency to abuse. Let's say they said, well, anyone who in order to buy a gun, you have to be adjudicated a certain amount of mental health. That is something that could very easily be abused. They could set that bar very high. That's already kind of started to happen in a restricted sense, where people who end up on suicide watch lists are sometimes getting, you know, uh, denied and up on the list just because someone, is mad at you or whatever. There's a question of due process here that is pretty unavoidable. So um, you'd have to talk about like wide scale bans, and then you're talking about banning millions or hundreds of thousands or thousands of law-abiding, totally safe people on the account of some tiny fraction that is unsafe, and that is that is not an ethical position I think that can be justified now. And even among those who make utilitarian arguments like, well, sure, we're inconvenience everyone who wants to own an assault weapon, so-called, but if it stops one of these shootings, then it's worth it because you don't really need the assault rifle. And these are overly simplistic analyses because they completely ignore all uh, all defensive uses of these guns and also all deterrent effects of these guns, which are very real. It's quite often you'll hear gun control supporters say stuff along the lines of, people don't use guns in self-defense because look at how many justifiable homicides there were. There weren't very many. In a given year, there might only be 400 or less. And so they say, look, guns are only used defensively for 400, 500 times a year. That's not very often. It's way lower than the number of people who are killed. And this is just completely asinine. Um, if you look at one of the most famous studies in this, the Kellerman study, asserted this because it counted. If you've ever heard, you're way more likely to be killed by your own gun than to kill an assailant. But then it's often misquoted as you're way more likely to be killed by your gun than to use it in self-defense. And so they only counted self-defensive uses if you actually killed an assailant. So if you shot your assailant and they were wounded and they didn't die, it didn't count as self-defense. If you fired warning shots and the assailant ran away, that didn't count as self-defense. If you just brandished your firearm and the assailant ran away, that also did not count as self-defense. And the thing is, the best estimates are that probably at least 95 and probably more than 99% of all defensive gun uses don't involve the perpetrator being killed or even shot. So they're right off the bat reducing the number of self-defensive gun uses by 99% or 95%. And it would be sort of like saying, look, we don't really need the police because how many people do the police kill every year? And it's not a huge number. It's like 1,000 or 2,000. And then saying, look, the police only stop 1,000 or 2,000 crimes a year. What do you mean they only stop 1,000 or 2,000 crimes a year? Well, they only kill justifiably 2,000 or 3,000 people. It might even be less than that. Of course, there's a lot of crimes that they stop that they don't kill someone. Like, yeah, exactly. That's the point. AR-15s, these semi-automatic rifles, they are used in self-defense quite regularly. You can find videos of it. There are news reports. They're just not national news. And I'm not saying that they necessarily should be, but they don't enter the mainstream media because stopping an event, stopping a crime, stopping a shooting means that there maybe wasn't anything at all that happened, or it was only one or two fatalities, or none, or only a wounding, and that's just not going to be national news. And the deterrent effects are real, almost certainly, but very difficult to measure. And that's when we're talking about criminals. When we're talking about the behavior of the government, that is a separate issue. I think that it's very likely that the fact that there's such a high level of armament within the US population is probably a deterrent to some effect on the government. You know, you don't have to, a porcupine does not have to be able to kill a lion for its quills to be an effective deterrent. Oh, you can't destroy the government with your assault weapons? Like, maybe not. I think that there's a big argument for asymmetrical warfare that in the right circumstances it's possible. If only 1 million people were fighting the government, then maybe not. If 50 million people were, different story, and I think that it just totally depends on how many people are on board with it and whatever. And that's not a question that you can answer simply for all generic possibilities. But a populace that's armed with nothing versus a populace that's armed with shotguns versus a population that's armed with all manner of firearms up to what we have now versus a population that's even better armed now, it's not like those are irrelevant distinctions from the point of view of a would-be oppressor. I think that that's completely asinine to think that they make no difference whatsoever. And the off-cited claim that, well, the government has nuclear bombs and so it doesn't matter that you have guns. Yeah, they're going to nuke all the towns where they have rebels. Anyway, kind of a tangent there. I don't think that there is a good solution that can promise to stop all of these events. The only thing that could reduce the rate would be a full-scale ban, because you will always have the problem of people who can pass the mental requirements but then deteriorate for whatever reason, or allow access to them to somebody else who didn't pass, right? This is the Adam Lanza case. He couldn't have gotten those guns, but his mother did. He had access via her. If there had been a blanket ban, she probably would not have had them. He wouldn't have had them. Boom, problem solved. That, goes into the whole utilitarian argument. But I think a really interesting kind of look at it, though, would be to say, well, what would happen in an anarcho-capitalist society? Because in an anarcho-capitalist society, the legal order is probably going to be one based on negative rights, arbitration, and common law, and not positive rights. There won't be positive rights. Uh, there won't be any institution that exists solely to give you shit for free as a right, but even more than that, there won't be these prohibitions on the freedom of association. Uh, you will not have laws that penalize discrimination, make it illegal essentially. And I think what we have today gives us a clue. We have the government, which is tying the market's hands in certain respects to how it can treat individuals. They can't discriminate against you. They can't charge you higher. They can, like insurance companies can charge you higher rates for certain health things, but not other things. Um, and but just think about, for instance, your credit score. This number that you don't even know about, but the market has created in association with your identity, and that number conveys a whole lot of information, and it's not perfect. I'm not one to say that it's perfect. But imagine if there were no positive rights and there were no restrictions on how businesses could discriminate. And you say that, and people immediately think, well, they're going to start discriminating based on race. And I think that that's silly. You might have some businesses that do that, but what they're going to really start discriminating on is risks and costs, and looking at each individual, like, is this person safe? And in a legal order that's based on restitution uh, and common law and arbitration, somebody's going to be responsible, right? So let's say that you have a crazy person. They're honestly crazy. That person, if that's literally clinically the case, you could make the argument, is not responsible. So if they commit a crime, who's at fault? Well, the person who, or at least has some of the blame, the person who is responsible. So Adam Lanza, his mother was responsible. And had she not been killed, she would probably be liable to pay restitution to his victims. And this would go for anyone who has a person who's not responsible, who's in their care, or who has access to their house, so usually family members or institutions, right? If you have like an orphanage or whatever. Or even a gun store. So let's say you have a gun store and they sell guns to people, and a mentally unstable crazy person comes in, and that crazy person, mentally incapable of being responsible for their actions to any large degree, then the gun store, I think, could be liable in that case. I don't think this would be true in a case where the person has no demonstrated ill intent or no demonstrated inability. But if somebody could be shown to be medically incompetent, then the drug, not the drug, but the guns retailer seller would be liable. And I think what we would see is you would have you would have your person, and then you would have your market identity, your proxy identity is sort of like uh, your credit rating, only much more expansive. And it's basically gonna be measuring: are you virtuous? Are you trustworthy? Are you a good person? Do you pay back your debts? Uh, are you a risk factor? Right? This already kind of happens in insurance. Like if you prove yourself to be a bad driver, your insurance rates get higher and higher, and there come a point when you can't afford insurance anymore. Now, in some states, you have a positive right to drive on the roads, even if you can't get insurance. Of course, in a private society, I think the private roads, most of them would either require you to have insurance or charge you much higher rates if you didn't, right? And so in a free market society, I think that there's going to be very, very strong incentives to be a virtuous, good person, to not be someone who is causing any kinds of problems, either criminal or not. Because anything that you do, just how like Google is tracking everything that you do and Facebook is tracking everything that you do, I think all of this stuff is going to be aggregated. And one of the reasons it's not right now is because the government is basically making it unusable, right? You can't generate data. They have ways of generating the data now, but like you can't apply it. If you can't go to the store right now and have a store say, we're charging you a higher price because according to your identity, uh, your market persona, you are a risk factor. You are, uh, and the thing is, they don't want to be liable, right? So if you are somebody who is violent, uh, even if you haven't killed anyone or been convicted of a crime, uh, it's likely that you will get progressively with fewer and fewer options when it comes to your life, whether it's buying a gun or buying a car, getting insurance. Um, I really do think that virtues are going to become market assets, and vices are going to start to actually have like a cost. And right now, the government is protecting you from a lot of those costs. They're protecting you from your own from being responsible. I really do see the government as a well of responsibility, where it says, look, you don't have to worry about your health care. You don't have to worry about your savings. You don't have to worry about your defense. These are all things that we will take care of, which they don't, by the way. They're absorbing those prerogatives, but then mismanaging them fundamentally. But what's even worse is it engenders this feeling of, I don't need to worry about this. I can just do what I want, and to an extent, obviously not completely, and not be punished for that, right? You're not going to be charged more when you go to the store. You're not going to be charged more when you buy a car. You're not going to be charged more when you try and rent a place. You're not going to be charged more whatever you do, right? And you could see a situation where people who are uh, problematic for whatever reason are going to pay higher prices everywhere they go. They're going to be denied service everywhere they go. And the only way to kind of for them to get back is to walk the straight and narrow, to do the right thing. Um, and I think that's where we would see. So I don't think you would ever see a blanket ban. All right, guns are going to be for sale. If you are a person who has shown no uh, indication of being a risk factor, if you're someone who's in control of yourself, who's a trustworthy, virtuous individual, and your credit persona, your market persona reflects that, yeah, you're probably going to be able to walk into a Walmart and buy a machine gun, and there really isn't a problem with that. If you are an upstanding person and you're responsible, there's not going to be a problem with that. Now, if you wanted to go in and buy artillery, you'd have to be very wealthy. So people go off on this, but it's practically not as. But they might say, okay, you need there's a higher bar here for us to sell you something like this. If we're going to hand over something that's this potentially destructive, for our own liability sakes, you need to have a virtue score that's over 1,000 or whatever. And there could be multiple different scores, or there could be a single aggregated one. I think the market will decide, what kind of works the best. Um, but a regular person is probably not going to have any problem. If you've had a history of mental health issues. If you've been committed, if you've had, uh, you know, aggravated assaults or a criminal record of any type, and then that's all going to be reflected in um, your market persona, and there isn't going to be any positive right for you to associate. There's not going to be anything stopping them from discriminating. And so a lot of them are either going to say you can't buy, or you can, but you have to pay a higher price because the added risk. And if you're talking about a person, a mentally unstable person who isn't in control of their senses and of their actions, who isn't volitionally fully a full agent, um, then anyone who sold you the gun could be considered liable. Um, and so they probably just wouldn't do it. Now, is there going to be some dealer on the side on black market, not even black market, but a dealer who isn't so worried about these numbers? Sure, it's just going to be a minority, right? You can always find less reputable things, but if the majority of the market, if the majority of the producers, if a majority of the retailers, if a majority of the sellers, and that's just of guns, this would all be integrated. This would be your insurance company, this would be your auto insurance company, this would be the company that you buy your road miles from, right? Like, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there were, you'd have toll roads and stuff, but a lot of times I think this would just be integrated into, you get a package, right? You get the travel package A, and travel package A is you drive wherever you want as much as you want, and it costs more per month. And then there's travel package B, which is like, we'll cover 80% of the tolls, but there are a couple places that we don't cover, and you'll have to get that yourself, right? And on and on and on and on and on. And you might have some roads that say, hey, we don't allow anyone on because these roads are just for automated trucks, and we don't want whatever. Um, but your insurance agency could be saying, look, you're very high risk, you're paying very high rates. We're going to cancel if you own a firearm at all. We're just going to say, nope, it's too risky. We can't insure you. We're not going to do it at all. And that would have a ripple effect. And it's not just the insurance company, it's everyone, right? So I think that the market would adapt to alleviate risk and potential liability as much as possible. And that, as a result, would alleviate the chances of something like that. Now, the chances will never go to zero. And a lot of people out there want somebody, some way to promise utopia, and whether or not it can be delivered is irrelevant. The promise itself has intrinsic value to a lot of people. It sounds rhetorically nice, but it's, the road to hell is paved in good intentions, right? Like, there is no perfect answer to this. Uh, but letting people take responsibility, making them take responsibility for themselves, it's going to address the vast majority of the gun violence, which is not by crazy people, by the way. So for everyone else, they're going to be ostracized and marginalized on the market in a completely comprehensive way that is going to either reduce them to poverty and really put them on the margins of society. Like, a lot of these really these really high crime areas, they only exist because the government is giving positive rights, saying, oh, you get it, you are allowed to live in the projects, you are allowed to live in these areas, you are allowed to go on the streets, you have free access. We have created a public space that cannot discriminate, and so they can just camp out in the heart of the big cities. And I think what you would actually see happening, that the retail value of that area would be too high. People like that, and people like that, I'm talking to the people who are actually committing most of the murders right now. They would be driven out, and they would either have to reform themselves to have access to civil society, or they would literally end up like in the woods. I think that's what you would see happening. You would see most of them having to make the hard choice and realizing that bucking the system and just saying, fuck society, I'm going to do what I want, then society is not going to, you're not going to have a pot to piss in. You're not going to have utilities. You're not going to be able to buy anything. You're not going to have a bank account. You're not going to be able to spend anything. You're going to be completely ostracized in a systematic way that currently the government does not allow. And there will be people who will still do it, but I think they will like literally end up like in the forests, in like little shanty towns, um, or in the mesas or whatever. Or they'll be dead, or they'll be enslaved to pay restitution for the crimes that they have committed. Um, but that's most of the murders. Like, the mentally unstable people are such a tiny thread of that. But yes, I think that even that thread could be reduced even further, not to zero necessarily, but much much lower. You know, if Adam Lanza's mother, her insurance company would have said, okay, sure, you are qualified to have these, but you have someone in your house who's not. And we already, to an extent, do this with like car insurance, right? I've known people who, they were not very good drivers. And so their other family members had to pay higher insurance rates because they have someone in their house who's a risk. There's no reason that wouldn't also be potentially applicable to someone who's at high risk of committing some kind of crime, whether it be mass homicide or not. And that would have, her she was following the rules, as far as I know. People can correct me if I'm wrong. I think she had them in a safe because I think that might be a rule in Connecticut, but she wasn't going any further than that. And you could definitely see a situation when the insurance company says, "We're not going to insure you unless those are gone, or unless you keep them at like a gun range, supervised or whatever else." Um, just because your son is a hazard, assuming that he was a hazard. If we're talking about a case where there's no warning, if there's no indication beforehand that the person is a risk, then that's like a scenario that you can't win, right? Like it's like what if a portal opens and an army that's way more powerful jumps out? What's Afghanistan going to do? It's like, well, that's the really shitty condition. How can they prepare? You're setting up the scenario in such a way that there is no way to prepare. And if you're talking about a person who is perfectly normal and then suddenly snaps, it seems very, very unlikely that you can really prepare for that. But to go back to like more and more powerful weaponry, I think they would take that into account and be like, okay, you seem good now, but we need to know that this is never going to go right, right? Or the probability has to be so low that it's worth risking. I mean, if you're selling like artillery or machine guns, it's like, whoa, what if someday they go crazy? We don't want to get killed. We don't want anyone else to get killed. We don't want to be liable. It's bad business, blah, blah, blah. They could set the bar quite high, and eventually it could even be prohibitively high for anyone. Although I think that's something that I can't answer beforehand what it would be. So that's kind of my idea. I think that, and I started a video series on this earlier that I should continue, but I really do think that the government acts as like a well for responsibility and virtue, and it really has long-ranging, far-reaching, insidious, subtle, but ultimately very important negative externalities on this. And this is one of the reasons, the fact that you can't discriminate. People just always associate discrimination with racism. And I think that you could have some discrimination based on racism, but you'd actually have a lot more discrimination based on actual risk factors. Is this person a good person or not? Is this person a trustworthy person or not? And if they're not, their insurance company is not going to let them drive a car. And the toll companies are not going to let them drive on their tolls. And the apartment companies are not going to let them live there. And the whatever, and they're going to have this identity that's attached to them whether they like it or not, just like you have a credit score whether you like it or not, and it's going to follow them almost everywhere. And yes, there'll be marginal businesses that don't check, that don't care, but that's going to reduce you from, instead of 100% of the market, to whatever, 5% or 6%, and it's going to be the cheapest stuff and the worst stuff, and it's going to be hard to find. And you add that in, like, okay, this person's mentally unstable and crazy, but they're going to somehow find the 1% or 5% of marginal gun dealers who don't care, who are going to sell regardless of what their risk factor is. And even that is very unlikely, because if you're a retailer doing that, then you would be liable potentially. And so you would be torted out of business. You would be sued out of business eventually, or you'd be really worried about it. It could still happen, but the incentive is against it, right? And having a system with the right incentives is going to have us develop in a direction that we want to go. Um, so anyway, those are my thoughts on that issue, and I hope that answers your question. All right, I will talk to you all another day. Bye bye.